It's no secret that I, for one, am fed up with writing about Muslims, reading about Muslims, defending Muslims and obsessing about Muslims in general. I'm trapped on a treadmill. Fatigue is setting in. Why am I having trouble moving on? I'm stuck with the Muslim tag, and the Muslim community is stuck with me. The minimalist Muslim born in a desert country, Kalgoorlie, Western Australia. Muslims are my tribe in the good times and the bad, and believe me, just like my footy team, the West Coast Eagles, we're not travelling so well lately. My footy team looks like picking up the wooden spoon this year, and as for Australian Muslims, well, we've been stuck near the bottom of the ladder in terms of Aussie rules and Aussie values for so long it's beyond a joke. Perpetual wooden spooners in Australian community relations. The minority group everyone loves to hate. The idea that flummoxes people. If you didn't have Muslims in Australia, you'd have to invent them. There must be a way to redefine the M word. To remind people, as the Prime Minister's parents once told their daughter, Julia, you can't judge a book by its cover. Or was it colour? Last May, the Rudd government, before it fell into its own identity quagmire, announced a multi-million-dollar handout in the next federal budget to halt the spread of radical Islam in Australia. The aim was to counter the growth of terrorist cells across the land, especially in jails, so it was said. It did cross my mind at the time that if the terrorists were already in jail, why we needed this. I also thought that the bikies and Aryan Brotherhood gangs were quite capable of resisting conversion to Islam. But what do I really know about jail culture? But back to my $1 million idea. Aha, thought I when I heard the news. For it struck me that some of my Muslim feminist friends and I, yes, there is such a species, could put up our hands before too many of our greedy, misogynist, polygamous, bearded brothers. You know the ones I mean, the ones who make us walk 5 paces behind them, before they got in the act and monopolised the funding. Now, we all know that Australian Muslims suffer from a massive PR problem, and there's an anti-Muslim virus spreading throughout the land in plague proportions. I don't think anti-Islamophobic injections are the answer, but I do believe the disease can be halted in time if we act quickly. The symptoms of the anti-Muslim virus are all too evident: a deep abiding fear of Islam, a tendency to see all Muslims as potential terrorists, and hand in hand with this, a questioning of values and loyalty to Australia, all wrapped up in that daggy expression, un-Australian. Is there no way of turning this around outside of running a Muslim MasterChef competition? But then again, Muslims with knives and choppers on Australian TV, perhaps not such a good idea. Now, I have a much better idea that I'd like to run past you. Why not hire a marketing expert to turn this trend around? Why not hire a well-known non-Muslim figure to undertake what must be the most challenging PR job ever known to mankind? To rebrand Australian Muslims by marketing them as lovable, huggable, defendable, dependable Australian neighbours who would be right at home in Ramsay Street. If only they didn't look so visibly different and insist on killing goats in the backyard. And here's a word of consolation. If you're worried that one day you might wake up and find yourself singing "Click Go the Shias Boys" in Arabic, stop worrying. It's not going to happen. Some of you in the audience may feel shivers running up and down your spine. You ask yourself, is this part of the Muslims taking over Australia plan? Step 1, infiltrate Parliament and the Immigration Department. Step 2, outbreed the real Aussies. Step 3, force Sharia law, polygamy and mass conversions on us all. A lot of Australians actually believe this hogwash. And I want to assure you at this point, the rumour that there's a secret tunnel running from the Preston Mosque to Parliament House in Spring Street is not true. The drains inside the mosque are blocked. It's a simple plumbing job. That's why there are holes being dug. That's all. Would I lie to you? Well, Andrew Bolt infers that I would, because Muslims are permitted to lie for the good of Islam, apparently. But let's move on with this hypothetical situation where I'm hiring a PR whiz kid to turn current thinking on Muslims around. I have in my mind a few likely souls who might take up the challenge. There's Mark Latham, Graham Richardson, and Megan Gale. You're waiting on Megan Gale, aren't you? Oh dear, if only Megan would turn her back on DJs, model a really chic chiffon hijab, reform her décolletage, and ditch boyfriend Andy for someone called Ali or Abdul or whatever. You think it's an outlandish idea? Well, let me tell you that white female hearts used to flutter in the days when Rudolph Valentino played the Sheik of the Desert. By the way, did you know that the Sheikh's ethnicity in the Valentino silent movies had to be re-scripted? Originally, Rudolph was an Arab, but this didn't go down too well in the Deep South in the 1930s. So he became a little Italian orphan boy, adopted, or was it kidnapped at birth, by a swarthy, childless, real sheikh of the desert. But I digress. Whichever PR firm takes on the Muslim makeover job, they'll really earn their fee. I'll even try persuading Saudi royalty that hiring a PR consultant is a better investment than building mosques and madrasas, but it won't be easy. We'd have to steer them away from their man in Lakemba, Sheikh Taj al-Halali, not the man for the job, I fear. But if I were on the selection committee, I'd set the applicants a real live test. I'd give them 48 hours to modify the behaviour of Pauline Hanson or Reverend Fred Niles. Yes, the same Fred who called for a 10-year moratorium on Muslim immigration some time ago, and Melbourne's own Pastor Danny. Some years ago, he drew up a list of Satan's strongholds. There were synagogues, mosques, temples, bottle shops and brothels. He also recently spoke against the PM's atheistness and child-freeness and views bushfires as God's punishment. If any applicant could get Pauline, Fred or Danny to make a pro-Muslim public comment, they'd get through to the next round. Of course, things would get tougher. In the end, I'd give the job to whoever could get Julia Gillard to hug a hijabi and then to go on and cuddle a brown baby on camera on the same day with a smile on her face. This could all take place while she stands grinning on the steps of the Preston Mosque. Even the Lakemba Mosque would do. A Muslim in Parliament and an atheist Prime Minister? No thanks, said dumped Liberal candidate David Barker recently in New South Wales. He was standing against ALP candidate, poor Ed Husick, a laid-back Bosnian Muslim who at every election knows what to expect. I'm not anti-Muslim, says Barker. Now, I happen to know for a fact that God once used to be an Englishman. But according to Mr. Barker, God is on the side of the Liberal Party of New South Wales, which makes God or Allah a member of the Liberal Party. I think not. Surely Allah is above petty party politics. Perhaps the greatest PR coup would be if atheist Julia finally embraced religion by becoming a Muslim. Of course, winning a trip to paradise would mean losing the prime ministership. But I fear my imagination is starting to get the better of me. But I'm not fabricating when I look back to the Howard decade, where our successful multicultural policies, another M word, were shoved to one side. A new manual on how to win elections was written. We're still trapped in that period, and an entire generation of school kids passed from year 1 to year 12 in the climate of those years. Today, some kids think it's cool to be racist. Just read the hate speech blogs. Currently, there's a strong belief making the rounds that some people are more Australian than others, that your loyalty as a citizen and your attachment to Australia is measured by how long you have lived here and how you look. People with problems become problems. Here I have in mind the latest generation of immigrants from Somalia and Sudan. The enormous social distance separating Muslims and non-Muslims exacerbates the anti-Muslim sentiment in Australia. A few years ago, I attended a Canberra conference where 300 non-Muslims and 30 Muslims came together to exchange views. 3 friendly women, whose honesty I appreciate to this day, confided that until the forum, the idea that Muslims possessed a sense of humour had never crossed their minds. They observed with surprise how much we smiled and joked. Another woman sought advice. Every morning a woman got on her train wearing hijab and sat head buried in a book, looking nervous and very much alone. "I don't know what to do," said the woman. "I don't think she speaks English." "Try smiling at her," I answered. She seemed nonplussed at my suggestion. The annual hijab debate is one example of the same old tired stories being served up year after year with the usual public response. Why? Earlier this year, 20 Perth journalists were surveyed. Not one of them could claim a Muslim friend or acquaintance. And now we're buried in burqas. The only good thing about the burqa debate, in my mind, is that it turns the hijab into a chic fashion item, like a beret or a cloche hat, at least during winter. Muslim women in Australia are really caught between a rock and a hard place. Why doesn't anyone listen to what we say? When we say the annual hijab debate is boring and irrelevant. But while Muslim women are the subject of countless books, they are not often listened to, especially if they don't cover. They don't see it as a religious requirement, but an individual choice. But when your hijab-wearing sisters are being targeted, you keep quiet. Sympathy and solidarity. Now, a new generation of strong Muslim women is revealing that the single definition of the Muslim woman is a myth, but it's hard-going. Western feminists see them as victims, and sometimes accomplices to their own fate. Muslim men provide the media with views on hijab, polygamy, and Sharia law. Men become the authorities with access to the media. It's men talking to other men about Muslim women. It's non-Muslim feminists telling Muslim feminists, "We know who you are." "Oh yeah?" The headscarf is like waving a red rag at a bull. Feminists charge in a swirl of dust and the annual hijab debate takes off. Does it really matter who covers or why you cover? Not unless you're in pursuit of the authentic Muslim or have a weakness for harem horror genre books with a niqab-covered woman on the front cover. Even the hijab is worn for real religious reasons or as a T-shirt with a message. If I was a Generation Y Muslim Australian, would I wear the hijab as an act of defiance? Yes, I probably would. And my headscarf would be in my footy club colours. And now we have the burqa. Let me be clear about this. I have little time for the burqa. I've seen it in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I know it for what it is. There's an old saying along the Grand Trunk Road in Pakistan amongst drivers. That's the road of Kipling and Kim. When driving, watch out for a donkey, a buffalo, and any woman wearing a burqa. But in Australia, I classify the burqa somewhat paradoxically along with the bikini. There are burqa babes and bikini babes. Women who cherish the uber modesty and women who bear everything except their souls. If a law were passed banning burqas in planes and banks, I wouldn't march on Parliament. But I don't swallow for 1 minute that all these male politicians have become feminists overnight. This outcry forces burqa-clad women to keep on wearing the burqa. And I ask myself, does it really matter if they choose to? I'm waiting with interest at the moment on the Perth judge's decision about a witness wanting to wear the burqa in court. A few days ago I read that in Australia 65% want the burqa banned, but only 3% want the balaclava banned. Because it's an issue in France and Belgium doesn't mean it has to become an issue here. And now allow me to become a little nostalgic. Audrey Hepburn, Sophia Loren, Gina Lollobrigida, and even the Queen were all hijabis in their day. The term hijabis is for women who wear hijab. Chiffon scarves floated in the breeze as they drove around in their convertibles with Gregory Peck, William Holden, and not Her Madge, of course. Dame Edna Everage, international celebrity now, but late of Moonee Ponds, is a woman some people might say should be forced to wear the burqa. But let me roll out another problem. The media wants the authentic Muslim. It slobbers over the images, and there is a plethora of Muslim men willing to stand up, hands in the air, "Please, sir, pick me." Yet most of the time, being too Muslim is frowned on. What does that mean? Is it the same as being too Jewish, or too Buddhist, or too Christian? To see events as the West versus Islam has an irresistible appeal to some. Visiting authors are assured of packed houses if they tell their audience that Islam is taking over Europe and the next stop is Australia. The new slogan is Islam versus the Enlightenment. Ayaan Hirsi Ali's recent article says it all. Headlines: Australians are too laid back. Culturally incompatible Muslims could threaten Australian society and values. While I admire disobedient women, there are times when a certain style of protest alienates the very people it supposedly represents. Sadly, Hirsi Ali's continual trashing of Islam alienates most Australian Muslim feminists who also see themselves as agents of change but are not prepared to turn their backs on what gives meaning to their lives. The bitterness they hear in her voice overwhelms them. They observe how her unrelenting message that Islam is brutal and uncompassionate is avidly received by the neocons. They start circling the wagons. They don't want to be pitied, they want to be understood. Unintentionally, I'm sure, Hirsi Ali silences them. As a woman, I empathise with Hirsi Ali. Her pain becomes my pain, but I cannot share her hatred. It's a pity that as a reformer she becomes repudiated by the very women she needs to co-opt as partners. Muslims are usually the people who get spoken about. Rarely are we the ones allowed to speak, and when we do, it's usually in response to what is being said about us. The idea that Western culture and values need defending in Australia, with Christianity under attack and Muslims outbreeding everyone else, is dangerous when it becomes part of the public discourse. After 9/11, a strange consensus fell into place. Defending Muslims, or being a Muslim, became complicated. Certain Muslim types were positively selected by the government and media as reliable spokesmen. Sociologists would say they became the normative types. Lots of committees were packed with mullahs and imams, men with their fingers on the community's pulse, and sometimes this was true. But here's the rub. These high-intensity Muslims, these so-called authentic Muslims with beards and turbans, were at the same time negatively selected by the media and the shock jocks as visible objects of hate. On the other hand, the low-intensity Muslims, Australian Turks, Bosnians, Albanians, New Muslims and other non-Arabs, sometimes some of them seen as less observing, they were cut out of the picture. These invisible Muslims were easily ignored because they couldn't be distinguished by dress or accent. Now you hear more of them, especially women and younger men born here. The Salam Cafe generation, I call them, who use the internet and can laugh at themselves. They know who they are and where they belong in society. Sometimes we're also concerned with debating identity that we don't analyse the meaning of belonging. Why not turn around and help young Muslim Australians grow a sense of belonging? Help them believe that they don't have to anglicise their names to get a job interview. Every identity needs sources of self-respect to be sustainable. Our media, popular culture and social landscapes located in schoolyards, at the beach, shopping malls, etc., they sustain and reflect majority identities. A beleaguered minority, on the other hand, has to scramble for self-respect. The T-shirt slogans, Lebo's Rule and Proud to be a Muslim, For example, seen on television images during the Sydney Cronulla riots in 2005, were a desperate adolescent attempt to find self-respect. When 60 Minutes held a forum to discuss the Cronulla riots, it was televised as a Muslim problem. In their eyes, it wasn't a suburban territorial dispute, not a law and order issue, nor an incitement to violence by certain shock jocks. Muslims were the problem. Muslim youth in the 21st century see few reflections of themselves in popular culture, and today the sit up and take notice of me images are of jihadist terrorists with rumour mills trundling out the sad, ludicrous messages that actor Will Smith or even poor old Michael Jackson were the latest celebrity converts. Redefining the M-word means subverting stereotypes. Minorities throughout history have always been stereotyped, often viciously. Stereotyping doesn't prevent you from defining yourself, but it becomes an uphill battle. It's been the fate of Irish Catholics, Aborigines, and Jews. In their countries of origin, Muslims are the majority, and when they come to Australia, many still have the complacency of feeling like a natural majority. You need time to learn the skills of being a minority that has to make it understood by a majority that want you to assimilate. This old policy has always failed miserably, even after mass migration from around the world following World War II. Migrants integrated, they didn't assimilate. But that's all you hear today. They don't assimilate. The term Australian community is heard everywhere. The term Australian Muslim community is heard everywhere. It's inaccurate, simplistic and misleading, but not even religious leaders bother to correct it or explain its diversity. According to Muslim academics, approximately 1/3 of Oz Muslims are devout, attend the mosque daily, observe ritual. 1/3 are nominal Muslims only, who may think of themselves as secularists, cultural Muslims, or even Muslims of the heart. Another 1/3 attend mosques now and then, and their degree of religious obedience fluctuates. Sounds a bit like Christianity, doesn't it? There's my answer. All groups, however, identify in some way as Muslims. Whether it's a religious identity or an expression of political protest, we tick that little box reserved for Muslims at census times. But Australian Muslims across the board do share things in common. The label Muslim has taken on a political identification because of what is happening in Palestine, Afghanistan and Iraq. Muslims in Australia, no matter how lukewarm their religious affiliation, overwhelmingly identify with what is happening in those countries. Just like other Australians have the right to hold political views, so do they. There is a tendency, however, for those preoccupied with the sufferings of their own tribe to often exhibit an inability or unwillingness to engage visibly with the suffering of non-Muslims. One might expect Australian Muslims who live as a minority to empathise in some way with persecuted Christians living under duress in certain Muslim societies. Often Muslims are too preoccupied with their own feelings of victimisation. The ugly expression, un-Australian, has an ugly meaning. It underlines subtexts which say, you are visibly different, you are not like us, you threaten our democracy. As Australians, we think we have a unique set of values. We weave intricate mythologies. On the subject of mythologies, years ago, on a hypothetical show, a former cricket-loving Prime Minister once told me that any attempt to intellectually undermine the Anzac tradition would be, and I quote him, to challenge one of the emotional underpinnings of our society. I quote him verbatim, we would lose our soul, he said. These were the words to me. I was a heretic who dared suggest that learning something about the Turkish version of Gallipoli might be useful for Australian students. I certainly think it's time for non-Muslims to engage with Muslims as ordinary people, not freaks. And then, if they're interested, move on to a better understanding of Islam as a religion. But knowing people first is important. See the human face of Muslims who mow their lawns, want to lose weight, worry about their jobs and mortgages, swap jokes or tell their children bedtime stories. See them as fellow Australians. It's really not so hard. And what of me? That ad, what about me? Will I really spit the dummy and stop writing about Muslims? Perhaps in the end it's better to write about yourself than sitting back waiting for others to write about you. Maybe my next book will earn me that fatwa I yearn for. Yes, I've longed for a fatwa to come down on my head for years. It does wonders for an author's print run. I've even thought of writing my own harem horror. I'd call it Fatima Goes to Bondi. But overall, I'm going to be optimistic. History tells us the Irish were not always beloved or welcomed into the Anglican and Presbyterian establishments of 19th century Australia. But that has changed. You know, I often glimpse interesting parallels between the two immigrant communities, the Irish and Muslim diaspora. Among the Irish, there were hardcore church Catholics, Irish nationalists with little religion. There were labourers and lawyers with varying degrees of religion, especially in the Australian Labor Party. And you had the cultural Irish in pubs and clubs and the wider community. Of course, to outsiders, all Irish were the same. And while certain insiders, the priests, sometimes wished all Irish were one obedient flock, reality was more diverse. I sometimes say to friends in jest, if you can love a Mick, you can love a Muslim. And when it comes down to it, perhaps I'm not joking after all. Thank you.